the, today's date, as of today's date, whether or not, or what the level of improvement has been, and in your mind, what are the major points that have not been improved on that need attention?
Through you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, this is fairly historic in the sense that it was 2010-11. Subsequent to that, I think we're now in the position that we will be issuing my report on 11, 12, and 12, 13, and that will continue to be a disclaimer for many of the same reasons that we've found in here. But I am more hopeful for 2013-14. We're actually going to be able to do an audit, we're actually in the process of doing an audit, so for the first time. So we have that date of the 30th of June 2015 to try and get to a position where we can reach an opinion, which we'll aim for, but with a touch of realism, it may be challenging, but that's what we're aiming for at this time. So I'm hopeful that we'll be able to reach actually have a proper an opinion rather than a disclaimer or no opinion, and we'll be able to move forward. But a lot of this is a very challenging task, and that is complicated by the structure as well. In fact, the fact that we're dealing with not just a consolidation, which is what we're dealing with. Actually, the recording of certain transactions in a financial statements for the first time, the executive transactions of government, all the coercive revenues, transfer payments, executive transactions, they are not recorded in entity financial statements. They're maintained in a second set of books by each entity, but are just recorded in the EPS. So that is obviously a complicating factor. So I think that's one of the major challenges. We're also, in terms of the actual consolidation process, in terms of the underlying entities, we'll be in a better position with the underlying entities in terms of their opinions and the quality of information that will be able to be subsumed into the consolidated the EPS financial statements. Because in prior years, one of the big issues has been, for example, disclaimers on major ministries of government, which to all intents and purposes means that you're going to end up with a disclaimer on the EPS anyway. Like, for example, district administration, works, lands and agriculture, tourism, they were always big challenges and always ended up with disclaimers, and that would have had such a big impact on the financial reporting and the Health Services Authority for a period of time as well. So some of those issues are disappearing. That will have an impact. We'll also have, although the resolution is not completely decided yet, around the healthcare liabilities. We have figures for those. There's a valuation of the fixed assets, and whilst the valuation has been, we've basically signed off in terms of the actual what was undertaken by the valuers, there's still some niggles around what's been valued and certain things that are missing and some inconsistencies in treatment and stuff like that. So there's still a few issues around that, but we do have a valuation, which is a huge step forward from that perspective as well. We're going to have some continuing challenges around coercive revenues for us is a big one from my perspective, particularly around the completeness of coercive revenues, but also the internal controls that ensure that it's accurate and everything else. So that is a huge part of our audit at the moment in time, in terms of looking at the coercive revenues of a government. One of the big issues previously has also been about whether from management's perspective, management are ultimately responsible in the Ministry of Finance for preparing these financial statements, and that they can prepare them, that they present fairly the transactions of government, etc. And have they been able to assert that they could do that? And that's been a challenge for them in terms of being able to say that. They haven't had the mechanisms to get the assurances themselves that what they provided to us in terms of consolidating the executive transactions and the entities, that they did present the transactions fairly of the whole of government. So we've had discussions with Mr. Dunn about how he goes about getting that assurance, and I'm sure he's progressing that, and I'm sure he can speak to that and going shortly. So I think, but how management gains assurance about what they're presenting to us as being reliable and accurate representation of the transactions of government has been a significant issue in the past. But we've had those discussions, and we know where the government. I think Mr. Dunn knows where he wants to go, but getting there is going to be the challenge at times, maybe, and he'll be able to speak to that more clearly. The issues around the elimination of inter-entity transactions, I think they've taken large steps to resolve some of those issues. We still find, though, that there's lots of transactions processed by journal entries, which, and sometimes without descriptions, which are entity transactions, which make that process even harder in terms of removing the duplication, eliminating those transactions within the financial. So there's going to be some issues around that. I think it's good to go back to the timetable issue that we talked about in terms of the compliance with the PMFL. Because of the issues we've had with underlying entities, and in lots of cases, even where we've issued unqualified reports, there's been huge levels of adjustments. The preparation of a set of consolidated financials has been challenging. And to do it as it's currently stands, to do it within the timetable would be probably nigh on impossible. Because in reality, if you're trying to do it within the timetable, you have to prepare a set of EPS based on draft statements, to be honest, or draft consolidation schedules, which you'd like to have some sort of reliability. And because of the issues we've had through the audits, there's been some issues around the reliability of some of the draft financial statements and the significant adjustments that have been required between the ones that are submitted on the 31st of August and the ones that get signed off eventually. So that would have had an impact. But if we get to that solid position where we're getting fairly clean opinions across the piece, generally speaking, the opportunity to be actually to produce the EPS within the timetable based on draft financials and then adjusting for any major adjustments in some of the underlying entities will be feasible. But that's probably a little way away at this stage, and that's where we should be aiming for. So not having to rely on having signed off financials from the Auditor General to base your consolidation on. So there's a lot of issues. I suppose the general position is that for 13 and 14, we're going to see a significant step forward from where we were. But I think the message is that there's still a long way to go. And as we're actually getting into doing a real full audit this time, we're probably going to pull out a whole load of other more detailed issues now around the various transactional areas, because to all intents and purposes, we haven't done an audit in the previous years because of the fundamentals that underpin the statement. So there was little point from that perspective. So we are going to pull out, I'm sure, nobody's surprised that there'll be a whole more detailed issues. And I think like the executive transactions is going to be the biggest, the area where we're going to probably find a lot of probably the issues around that, in terms of particularly around the revenues, in terms of completeness, insurance around accuracy, and the systems and internal controls, which we already know about through our reviews of the IT systems previously, which we're just repeating now.
Any questions? No. The executive transactions, effectively, I mean, I see you shaking your head. Effectively, I think it's important for us to understand that, I mean, with even issuance of these 2011 financial statements, you give a disclaimer of opinion. You effectively state clearly, I am not able to give an opinion. Effectively, then, your executive transactions remain unaudited, and for, essentially since the implementation of the PMFL.
Basically for 10 years.
Yeah.
Now, I just qualify that by saying we haven't audited as part of the financial statement, the EPS. We've looked at some of these areas as part of our performance audits and compliance work, but obviously we haven't, if all things being equal and had the resources, we'd probably done more of that, but that's the reality of life at this moment in time. We haven't been able to get into all the areas we'd like to have done in terms of the executive, but we haven't audited as part of these financial statements, but we do have looked at various aspects within our performance audit practice.
Okay.
And you also state then at this point that the 2012 EPS statements and 2013 are likely to include a disclaimer as well.
Yes, sir.
Yes. Okay. Early days for 2014, but you note the improvement. In terms of auditing the and you say now you're actually doing audit work on the 2013-14 executive transactions. Are you encountering similar issues as you would have had with the entity types audits of entity financial statements?
I'll probably pass that on to my colleague Patrick Smith to discuss in detail at this stage. I think one of the complicating factors is that just to highlight some issues, like we look at it as a whole globally as from the financial statements perspective. So we would look at try and auditing it from that perspective, but obviously it's maintained in separate ledgers or separate parts of IRIS by each of the individual entities themselves. They maintain a separate books for their executive transactions. So we're trying to, so we don't audit each individual entity's executive transactions in that sense. We try to look at it as the totality to test it and audit it. So, but that's a complicating factor in it.
Mr. Chairman, I think the AG can answer the question in totality actually, but at this stage, we're in the very, very early stage of assessing the executive transactions, but we suspect that the systems are going to be the key focus for us at this point in time. As he mentioned, for entity, we looked at individual agencies more or less. For the executive, it's more of a high scale level of assessment. So our concerns are more about the processes in place, the controls in place, and the systems in place. We've been working very closely with the Accountant General, and so far we're confident that things would be pretty rosy, hopefully, at the end of the day. But I think so far we've actually seen very vast improvement between what we would have seen years ago in 2011 at entity level.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, just one further comment around the executive transactions. There's an issue about who is ultimately responsible for those in terms of the governance process, because in terms of the systems and process to do that, because it's clear about the entities in terms of the chief officer has the responsibility to ensure that the systems and processes are in place to record the entity transactions and present the financial statements. That's not the same for the executive transactions. So whilst the entities may do that, there's nothing specified in the law regarding that, and so there is potentially a gap in terms of that position, in terms of the accountability for ensuring that those systems and processes to effectively process those transactions.
Okay. Any other questions, comments? Mr. Connolly?
Just now to the Financial Secretary and Mr. Dunn, in that you've obviously read the report, and can you tell us exactly what you've been doing to ensure that 2013, 2012 are kind of different, meaning that when we get those financial statements and we get to the point where they can be an audit for the first time, what are the steps that you've taken since this report and the dialogue with the Auditor General's office to get us to where we need to be thus far?
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. Mr. Chair, through you, the Auditor General just outlined a number of the improvements that were taken to improve the quality of the consolidated financial statement, so I won't seek to repeat those. It's more of a partnership in terms of the improvement and the assurance that we're going to be able to provide. One of the deficiencies identified was the inability of Ministry of Finance or management to attest to certain aspects of the financial statements. We are taking a closer look at the underlying transactions during the financial years. We report on a monthly basis to Cabinet, providing management reports, and when those ledgers are reviewed, issues identified are communicated to agencies with recommendations for changes and amendments to have improvements. I do not have as pessimistic a view around the executive ledgers. We do know that we have issues around revenue completeness, and that is going to obtain for at least another 2 years. But when you look at the transactions at the executive level, you have 100 million of that. It's in output funding to statutory authorities, government-owned companies. Fairly confident that we can substantiate the checks that were written, who they were written to, and what they were written for. It's another $20+ million outputs from non-governmental organization. We can attest to those as well. Transfer payments, another 30 million, financing expenses, so on and so forth. So I feel, as Mr. Smith indicated, the issues may be around the systems in terms of this transfer payment was made, but was it carried out in accordance with the intentions of the Legislative Assembly from a governance perspective? But insofar as are you able to verify that how this 30 million was spent, where it went, and what were the procedures in place to manage it? I feel fairly confident that we're going to be able to attest to those, and the audit process will go smoothly in that respect. We've also tried to work in a supporting environment with the underlying agencies over the year since the 2010-11 report has come out. And again, that is manifesting itself in improved opinions. And from any auditor's perspective, when you audit a set of financial statements, it's audited on the basis of materiality. And so there are going to be issues which continue for some time, but as you pointed out earlier, material agencies like the former District Administration Works, Lands and Agriculture, Tourism and Development, and the HSA, which is about $100 million organization, with the issues being sorted out in those agencies, it's giving us a much better opportunity to get to a set of financial statements that, even not perfect, if you can get to a qualified opinion where just the specific deficiencies are identified, but then you're told that everything else can be fairly, relied upon, would be a significant improvement. As far as the revenue is concerned, again, one of the major deficiencies there was the inability to audit the IRS system by going in there and saying, okay, if there's been $100 million or $600 million collected, I can go through and see from invoice 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to whatever thousands there were, and see that there's been no gaps in that sequence, so I can assure myself that what has been presented is a complete picture. Previously, we had issues in having that sequencing system within the IRS system. That is now been addressed in the upgrade. So having addressed the core system within central government, the focus then will turn onto the underlying supporting systems, as I noted earlier, like IMSS and David and TRIPS and others. So it's a continuing effort, Mr. Chairman, and I'm very hopeful and positive that with time we will get there.
Mr. Chair, if you could just indulge me a few seconds. I just wanted to explain something mainly to the listening public, because I think they may be thoroughly confused as to our discussions about entity versus executive transactions, because it's not easily understood. And I won't dwell on it very long. I think the best way of explaining it is by way of example. We all know that ministers' portfolios and offices, we are there to serve the cabinet. We produce outputs. We produce in the form of policy advice to the cabinet, and for that, for those services that we do provide to the cabinet in turn will fund an individual ministry portfolio and office for those services provided. That relationship between the cabinet and the individual ministry and portfolio can be best encapsulated with the term, that's an entity transaction. And when the Auditor General audits individual ministries and portfolios, that's precisely what his office is auditing. Transactions taking place, being done by an individual ministry and portfolio essentially to provide services to the cabinet, which will incur obviously costs such as personnel costs, supplies and materials, depreciation, etc. There are costs involved in providing those services. And in return, the payment from the cabinet to the individual ministry portfolio becomes revenue for the individual ministry portfolio office. So that relationship is best described as an entity relationship between the cabinet and the individual ministry portfolio. There are other transactions which are outside of that relationship with an individual ministry portfolio, although they actually carried out. So as an example, tremendous amount of revenue coming in to the government, to the cabinet, in the form of import duties, in the form of bank license fees, in the form of work permits, etc. Those are described as as executive transactions that are due to and belong within the domain of the cabinet. And what we've been hearing is that, and there on the expense side, there are other transactions on relating to expenses which are not necessarily within the ambit of an individual ministry and portfolio. So there's tremendous amounts of services that are provided by statutory authorities and government companies to cabinet. Again, those are executive transactions. They are transfer payments that are made from central government to entities and persons outside of even the public sector. Those are, again, executive transactions that involve the decisions that the cabinet want to incur. What the Auditor General was saying earlier is that his review is concentrated at the moment on the individual ministers' portfolios, entity transactions, but when it comes to obviously a consolidated position, executive transactions obviously need to be brought into account. And he was making the point earlier that those transactions are some of the areas that are giving some difficulty. He was mentioning that, you know, whereas the relationship with entity transaction is clear cut and defined within the PMFL, those with the executive transactions are not so well defined. So I think the public perhaps does not quite understand this distinction between entity and executive, and it is a bit confusing.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Dunn?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just wondering if I could take this opportunity to perhaps get the views of the Auditor General in relation to the framework and hierarchy that we operate within. Insofar as I got a 8-page rep letter, sort of draft, to look at for the 13-14 accounts. And one of the representations from the Ministry of Finance would be in relation to the internal controls that are within the underlying agencies. And sort of having the view of the Honorable Deputy Governor as the CEO of the organization, and with the financial regulations placing the onus on chief officers to establish, maintain proper internal controls, whether the view should be less so the Ministry of Finance representing on the entire public sector. I mean, we can certainly prepare it, but I think act more in the capacity of the government's chief financial officer. And in the preparation of that annual consolidated financial statement, you can make representation and give assurance to Deputy Governor that the consolidation process was done properly, the standards were observed, et cetera, but then you'd have a corresponding set of assurances from chief officers that says, I've had good internal controls in place and there were no legal violations. And the collective assurance from both the opinion of the Auditor General and the underlying agencies, the assurance of the Ministry of Finance in the preparation process, and the assurance from chief officers about the underlying internal controls that are in place would enable him to then sign off and make a representation to the Auditor General about the presentation of financial statements overall. And what do you think that would be more effective and a more practical solution than the Ministry of Finance, who do not really have a lot of controls and oversight necessary to make a representation?
Auditor General?
I think we're getting into some fundamental issues
Yes.
regarding governance here. I think the theory is the same no matter what, how it's structured, and ultimately, the, I think we've discussed this, is that the CEO, obviously Mr. Manderson, and the CFO, Mr. Jefferson, are the two signatures to the account, or should be from our perspective. And then how does the governance flow from that about being able to make management representations about what they presented as financial statements? And there has to be an assurance framework somewhere in this process, whether that's to Mr. Manderson or through the Ministry of Finance. So I think you can be the conduit for it at least. And I think as the professional accountants producing the accounts, it's maybe appropriate that it flows through you. But there has to be a mechanism where chief officers can assert or provide assurance that their financial statements are, et cetera, compliance with standards, et cetera, and that they have the internal control frameworks to effectively manage those standards, that their transactions and their operations. I think there has to be assurance framework for that. Then it comes down to about how do they get that assurance themselves regarding their internal control frameworks? What monitoring do they do? What internal audit do they do? What other insurance mechanisms do they have internally within their offices to provide them with the assurance that the systems are working effectively and providing them with the right information? So there's a big discussion that has to be had around how that can happen, because I think some chief officers would maybe balk at the idea of signing a statement that says that all the internal control systems are working effectively and et cetera, et cetera. I think they're maybe not in a position to effectively say that, and they have to work out how that can be done. In our jurisdictions, there's requirements in the public sector as well as in the major listed companies for them to produce statements of internal control or governance statements as are required as part of their financial statements, which actually require them to say that within those financial that the systems of internal control, risk management are working effectively, and we know of no issues that would impact on it. That's not quite the right words. And then the auditor gives a negative opinion that he's found nothing that contradicts that. So there needs to be further consideration on these border issues, but there has to be a mechanism which flows up from the SAGCs as well to the chief officers in the ministries about how they get assurance regarding the information that have been provided. Say that again.
No, I was saying it could probably be a similar system as what is required in Sarbanes-Oxley, where there's actually a certification of the internal controls in place, and maybe that needs to be signed off.
Whether you want to go down the Sarbanes-Oxley and the COSO route is another question, because that's a huge pile of work, which I don't necessarily.
Right. No.
But there has to be a mechanism where they can provide assurance that that their systems are working effectively, so they can provide assurance to yourselves, and then they have to look at how their mechanisms get assurance, and that comes down to some like your colleagues at the back there, how they can provide assurance to their chief officers regarding their financial systems, and it actually gets broader than just financial control. It's about internal control as an organisation as well, because that impacts everything at the end of the day. So how they get assurance about how their internal control framework and what mechanisms they have in place to monitor that, get assurance from internal audit, et cetera, et cetera. So.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair. I mean, I think it's a valid discussion in the context of looking for a solution, and maybe putting in place a requirement for agencies to maintain certification for their internal control procedures, which are periodically tested and recertified by the internal audit unit, might be a useful part of an assurance framework in being able to further attest up the line that everything is working, because you can't necessarily put the fox to watch the chickens to get the agencies themselves to say, yes, everything is working. I think it's important that you have a neutral, independent, qualified body come in and say yes, and in my view, that's the internal audit unit.
I think there's a model of 3 lines of defense, which is you got your first level, which is the internal management review and assurance processes themselves, which is the monitoring that's undertaken, and CFOs normally have a huge role in that. But then you have the internal audit as a second line of defense, which you come in, and then third line of defense is us on the outside here. But ultimately, I think it's a lot of it has to be looked at. The first stage is for each agency to look at it themselves as well, how they can do it themselves. A key issue here is internal audit in terms of what role they have and can they provide an assurance service to government in compliance with internal audit standards, which enables them to produce an annual report which says that from the basis of their work, the internal controls are operating reasonably or adequately, or whatever wording they're using these days. And at this present time, internal audit is not in a position to be able to do that on an effective basis for core government. Couldn't do it for one ministry at this moment in time, let alone core government as a whole. And then that's a huge challenge in terms of how they can forward, so they can effectively provide that report, because that is a key part of any assurance framework, is that annual report which says they provide reasonable assurance by the internal control framework.
Any other questions for witnesses? If there are no other questions, then I would bring this portion of our hearing today to its conclusion, and to thank all of the witnesses for your time here this morning. I think it's been an interesting exchange and some good ideas coming through from this that no doubt will filter through to our report. But I would like to thank you all for your presence and for your contribution to the discussion today. We will go ahead and we will break for the lunch. I would like to keep us onto our timetable, and let's try and limit it to no more than 30 minutes for lunch. Is everyone comfortable with that? I'm going to drive us today. But looking at the schedule for the rest of the afternoon, we're not, we're going to be taking our last witness at 4 o'clock. And I'd like to, keep to it as close as we can. Okay? Thank you all. You're all excused.